really want just to talk about the history, and in particular the way that C.L.R James and also Eric Williams contributed to the whole history and understanding of slavery. These two men, both from Trinidad, were friends. And I have to say at this point, they fell out big time. You know, like you've fallen out with people before, but I don't think, you know, when your girlfriend let you down, you ever made a revolution against her and tried to overthrow the government that she was the leader of. That's how bad it was between C.L.R James and Eric Williams. But that's another story. What I want to talk about is these two men and what they did, which is remarkable and has changed everybody's understanding of the question of slavery in a cool way, not in an emotional or an artistic way, in a way of measuring and understanding the real history of slavery, in particular of the Atlantic slave trade and its importance. These two men, they began to look at the history of slavery in a way that was critical, that didn't accept the received opinion, because they'd both grown up in classrooms with hard-working school teachers with a picture of William Wilberforce hanging on the classroom wall to show that the people of Trinidad, like all the people of the West Indies, should be grateful to the men who were, without irony, called the saints. That's to say, the abolitionists of England, the people who had moved the argument to abolish slavery in the British Parliament and in the colonies and had set them free. And both James and Williams, I think, would have looked upon that picture at first with real feeling and sentiment, and then later with a degree of anger and distrust at the story they were being told, that they had been set free. And this, I think, is the starting point, really, of the critical history of slavery, the attempt to understand slavery not as it is told, as a generous story of liberation and friendly, benevolent act by the British Parliament. Anybody who's read James's fabulous history, The Black Jacobins, will know that at the core of this story is the people who freed themselves. And that is the real weight of James's intervention. The strength of what he writes is that it wasn't the case that people were set free, they weren't released, they weren't liberated by distant, benevolent philanthropists, they made themselves free. He chose that history because it's a history of a people who made their own freedom. Now then, Williams is altogether a difficult character in the discussion of slavery. Whereas James' contribution in time were welcomed, Williams is a man of whom it has been said 100 times in 100 different books and articles, Eric Williams is wrong because, and the reasons why Eric Williams is wrong are always different. They're always a different reason. He's wrong because he's unsympathetic to the philanthropists. He's wrong because he's too much of a left-winger. He's too much of a Marxist. And the reason he's wrong is the things that he said were shocking. They were truly shocking to the audience that heard them. The first thing he said is that the origins of all the capitalist wealth of London, of Britain, were to be found in the slave trade. So what you might say, I can assure you that in 1944, when he published his book, Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams' proposition that the foundation of the wealth of the most benevolent, liberating nation in the world, Great Britain, were in the slave trade, were truly shocking. Both James and Williams had read in Karl Marx's book about capitalism a particular chapter that attracted them. It's quite near the end, and it's called Primitive Accumulation, which is a fancy term for a particular economic problem that was raised at the time when people were talking about how do markets work. And the problem was, where does the money come from in the first place? You know, what's the investment fund that allows a business to begin? And the people that worried about these things, they said, oh, well, you know, there must have been some guy who was like really abstemious and saved up his money. Unlike all those idiots who were spending their wages and wasting themselves, he was saving up so that he could start a little business, which is a nice story. Marx, who you understand wasn't particularly sympathetic to that view, said, I don't think history was like that at all. He said, look at what really happened. He said, where did the money come from? Theft and thieving and piracy. He said, where does the wealth come from that begins the industrial age? It comes from people like John Hawkins and Walter Raleigh stealing ships that were crossing the Atlantic laden with gold from the New World. That's where the investment fund comes from. And in a small passage in that particular chapter, and he says, and from stealing people, from slavery. Marx didn't make that much of it. It wasn't really his issue. But James and Williams, they were really interested and began to look and ask the question, where did the money come from that was the foundation of the British Empire? Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, has not been surpassed for his explanation of where the money comes from. The money comes from the triangular trade, the trade whose real foundation is stealing people from Africa and selling them in the West Indies, and with the money that you make there, bringing back sugar that's made in the West Indies back to England to sell it, maybe to sell it on in Europe. The triangular trade. What Williams shows in such perfect detail is that all of the wealth of Britain stems from that original act. He doesn't dismiss the importance of industrialization. He doesn't say that the industrial worker in Britain wasn't also later the foundation of the wealth. He says, where did the money come from in the first place? He says it comes from slavery, and slavery is at the core. Well, I can tell you, when that was published, some people were very, very unhappy about what he'd said. He said another thing that really irritated quite a few people, and he said this, which is kind of thinking about that portrait of William Wilberforce. He said, when the abolition came, maybe there were moral feelings, maybe it was sentiment, maybe it was philanthropic feeling that made the British Parliament change its laws on slavery. But was it not also the case that they changed their laws because they worked out that the plantation system in the West Indies was so bankrupt, having produced so much wealth, was now indebted, ruined, that they'd sucked dry the West Indies and bled dry the people that were creating all that wealth, that they shed that wealth readily and took the money back to London to start their industries. And then he said this thing, which was so offensive to everybody, was that in truth, it was a good business plan. He said, maybe there was morality involved, but let's face it, it was a great business plan to take the money from the West Indies and invest it in British industry. And they knew the mercantile era, the West India interest, had had its day. The planters had enjoyed their wealth in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, the truth was they were really not the future for British capitalism. The future belonged to industry, and the West Indies were left and abandoned. And that was really shocking, as you can imagine, because not only had he said that the foundations of British success in industry were in slavery, but it also said that far from being a moral act, the liberation, the abolition of slavery, was a simple business deal. So, for those two reasons, Eric Williams had to be wrong. And so the scribes started their work, because what he was saying was too shocking. The people that they're most important to are a man called Roger Anstey. Roger Anstey was an English historian, and he said, no, it can't be true, because I've looked at the figures, I've looked at the numbers, and actually the profits of the West India plantations were quite small and played no great part in the fund of industrialization and capitalism in the West. And people said, yes, Anstey's shown that Williams' rather romantic view, which is obviously politically inspired, can't be true. And Anstey was very popular with another academic, an American called Seymour Drescher, who's still alive. And Seymour Drescher said, yes, it can't be true, because In any event, I know full well that the West Indies were booming and slavery wasn't unprofitable at all. And look, in Cuba they made a fortune from slavery long after it was abolished. So it can't have been for economic reasons. Now then, I can't go through all of the detail about how the argument played out, but I can say this. Those two views, Anstey's and Dresch's, which for so long were accepted as good coin, mostly are rejected today. Less so in the United States, more so in Britain. And they're rejected for a simple reason, and that is because at the University College London, a scholar, Catherine Hall, widow of the late Stuart Hall, has been involved for some years now with Nick Draper and many other researchers in tracing the actual sources of cash from the West Indies. And slowly they've been putting it online. And the truth is that we now know that it's unavoidably the case that most of the early investment funds, or substantial proportion of the early investment funds, did indeed come from slavery. That Barclays Bank, though the Barclays brothers were very much anti-slavery Quakers, all their money came from trading with slave traders, slave merchants in Liverpool and other cities. That was the foundation of their wealth, as it was the foundation of the wealth of London, as it was the foundation of the wealth of Bristol and Liverpool and Glasgow and all these Georgian cities built upon the slave trade. In some senses, the reason that we're sensitive to this is partly because the mood has changed. Emotionally, the mood has changed. So if you go now to Bristol or Glasgow or Liverpool, you'll find a big part of their local museum is given over to the slave trade. And you'll find that the good citizens of Bristol promote their cities out of guilt. They say, look, these terrible things we did. Come to our museum and we'll tell you how guilty we are about what we did in the past. That's a different kind of emotional response. You might, if you were really cynical, you might say that that's how capitalism works. You know, they exploit you once, and then they sell you a book about what a terrible time you had when you were being exploited. But I wouldn't want to say that. It would be a terrible thing to say. Similarly, Seymour Drescher, I can't go into all the detail. Why was he wrong? I think he was wrong mostly because he only looked at the mass of cash. He looked at the amount of money the Cubans made when they were selling sugar subsequently. But what he didn't look at was the demoralization and bankruptcy of the estates and plantations in the West Indies. He didn't look at what was happening in the West Indies, that all of those plantations were massively indebted, hundreds of them every year were bankrupted, that they were changing hands all the time for the simple reason that they weren't making the kind of money that they were previously. And when the West India interest, as it was called, the lobbyists for the planters, would come to Parliament, parliamentarians would complain about the whining cant of the West Indian planters, always asking us for grants and money to subsidise them, which was the beginning of a very interesting story. Now then, the debate was had out, and for a long time it was suffered that anybody who thought that Eric Williams was right or C.L.R James was right was just a crank, some over-radical, nationalistic third worlder who had no real say. But over time, we've come to understand that they were right after all, and the people who were cranks and apologists and liars were the ones who tried to say that what they said wasn't true. I want to talk about the issue which all of this leads to, and I think will be the issue for some time now, which is a question of reparations. The moral argument for reparations is very strong. The argument says that the crimes, the exploitation of the African people who were enslaved and sent to the West Indies is so great that reparation must be made for the crimes that were committed against them. C.L.R James took a slightly different view and had some harsh arguments with some of the people who believed in reparations, and I think I know why. But I'm going to go a little bit around the houses, and that's to say I want to give you 3 instances where attempts were made to make reparation or compensation for the slave trade in real history, in the events that took place. Because I want to say to you, this is not the first time we've been asked about reparations. In fact, there are 3 successive attempts that the British government made to make reparation or compensation for slavery, but each and every case ended in disaster for the people who you would think would be the object of the large S. Now, the first attempt, some of you know this story, but it's so shocking morally that it's easy to stop listening because it seems so crazy. But this is the truth. In 1833, when slavery was abolished, there was a £20 million compensation fund created to compensate. When I say £20 million, I want to emphasise that was 1/20th of the whole of the gross domestic product of Britain. It's a vast sum at the time, and it was given to compensate the slave owners. Those were the people who were compensated in 1833. Now, when I say that, you'll be thinking, whoa, you know, it might be like a white noise at this point. You're thinking, I hate these people so much, I can't listen to anymore. But I want to try, and this is just embarrassing really, to try and explain to you what was going through their minds when they made this decision, because it isn't quite as crazy as you seem. It is, but it isn't quite as crazy. This was the reasoning that Thomas Buxton, who was the leader of the Parliamentarians in the anti-slavery movement, he said, look, he said, slavery is an evil, we must abolish it. But it was an evil of all of us. It wasn't only the people who owned slaves, it was all of the British who had the laws that made it possible for people to own slaves. And furthermore, he said, we need to abolish slavery. We need to win this argument in Parliament, because if we don't, then it will go on, and the misery will go on. And if the price is to buy out the slaves, then that's a price worth paying to get rid of slavery. Now, I'm not saying he was right at all. Many people at the time said it was monstrous. Joseph Sturge, the people in the agency committee, the out-of-doors campaigners, they were big on the wickedness of the compensation move. But it was a real thing that happened. What Buxton was really saying was that we need abolition to happen, but we mustn't expropriate property. The very idea of abolishing property, even a property in people, was something that couldn't be uncompensated, because that would be a breach of the rules of property. And that as far as the British Parliament was concerned, property was king. And if property in people is wrong, then those people who owned people must be compensated. So what he's really saying is reparation, compensation in this context, means to overcome the problem but retain property rights, if not in people, at least in other kinds of capitalist investment. And that was the foundation of the idea, and it's why it won. Now, people don't know so much that actually it was a proposal by the slave owners before it was a proposal by the abolitionists, because they were broke. Their plantations were massively indebted. They came to Parliament asking to be compensated. They said, if you want to abolish slavery, buy us out. We don't like it there anyway. We're never there. You may have noticed we're always here spending the money. So buy us out. We've got debts. What the consequence of that means, and this is a difficult thing to say, that the abolition of slavery, as it actually happened, the way that it was conducted was itself a disaster. It was itself a disaster for the West Indies. Now that you may think I've gone crazy. How could it be a bad thing to abolish slavery? Of course it wasn't bad to abolish slavery, but this is what actually happened. Those people in the West Indies had property. They owned plantations. Those plantations were indebted to the sum of about £20 million. Indebted to whom? People in London, bankers, merchants, other people who'd invested in those plantations. So what happened when the £20 million compensation was paid from London is that it went for a second to the West Indies, and then it went straight back to London, because all the money just passed through in an invisible circuit to pay off the creditors of the plantations. What was the net effect? The net effect was that was the richest part of the British Empire perhaps in some ways the richest part, even richer than Britain at certain points, in terms of the wealth it generated, was within a generation made into the poorest part. All the wealth was abstracted from the West Indies through the act of compensation. Reparation and compensation at that point, even though it was intended to make life better for slaves, but it meant that the people of the West Indies were sentenced to grinding poverty for decades, for generations afterwards, and they were impoverished by the act of compensation. You'll say, well, obviously they compensated the wrong people. That's absurd. That couldn't be a case of reparation. I'll give you now the second attempt at reparation. And people don't know this so much. You know, it's a big campaign, reparations. They don't know that the British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, thought that this country does owe a great debt of reparation to Africa. That's Lord Palmerston talking in the 19th century. So if anybody wants to make the campaign, you've got it on print because Palmerston said it. We owe a great debt. It's an interesting question. How did you repay the debt, Lord Palmerston? What did you do as Prime Minister of England to repay the debt? This is what he did. He was giving a speech when he said this country owes a great debt, to say what we need to do is to put loads of ships, armed ships, in the Atlantic, off the coast of West Africa. It was called the Africa Squadron. By 1867, there were 25 of these ships. There were 2,500 sailors working on them. They had wages of £77,000 every year spent upon them. A lot of them died, and those men were there as part of the Africa Squadron, whose official policy was to police and prevent the slave trade. And that was the reparation that he was going to make, that Britain would become the anti-slavery power instead of the slavery power. Since then, historians have taken a rather more jaundiced view of what did the West Africa Squadron achieve. Well, they did free slaves, it's true, but the ways that they freed them were complicated. Under the agreements that the British had made their allies commit to, what they also did was it was a bit of a tough thing, you know, it depended where the ship was intercepted. If it was close to West Africa, they would drop you off at Sierra Leone, which maybe wasn't where you came from, but that's where you were going. But if you were over the other side, closer to the Americas, they would drop you off the nearest place there. So you might get dropped off in Cuba. That wasn't so good a deal. You were called emancipado. That's Spanish for free. Emancipados were the slaves in Cuba. What the Spanish authorities did in Cuba was they called their slaves emancipados because the reason they were there is being freed by the West Africa Squadron. Many people were freed by the West Africa Squadron and found themselves in their free state working on sugar plantations in the British West Indies. It still meant they were cutting cane in a place they'd never been to before and lived their lives in some difficulty. The French, they noticed that, well, suddenly there's a lot of Africans here who don't know where they're from, you know, because they've been intercepted and dropped off on the coast in some other place from where they were and were at a bit of a loss. I know, said the French, we'll call them engagés. It's a bit like emancipado. You're engaged. Engagé is a kind of slavery by another name. So when the West Africa Squadron started to free people, in truth, they were reforming, they were changing the relations. It wasn't quite slavery. You had to work sort of 30 years and then you were free. That's not slavery, I suppose. But as people said at the time, slavery by another name. Engagé, slavery by another name. But what was most important for Britain was that their West Africa Squadron wasn't just a means for fighting slavery. It was the way of keeping ships in the sea. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they had a big problem of justifying their military expenditure, their naval expenditure. Why would anybody put up with the British raiding their ships in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Well, now they had a reason, because it was all written down in all the international agreements. We will raid your ships just to see if you're carrying slaves. I don't think they were that interested in slaves. What they were really interested in was having a big navy that had the right of search And it was a justification, this humanitarian imperialism, for spending money on its massive navy. And this navy, bear in mind, was policing the west coast of Africa, Cuba, and the Americas. All of the places that Britain was interested in asserting its power. And they did assert their power. They waged war upon the peoples of West Africa and colonized more and more of the coast of West Africa. They waged war cynically on the very people that they had traded with in the past, the Ashanti most importantly. So that was, I think, a kind of remarkable effect of this act of reparation. What will we do to help you? We'll build a great big navy, we'll police your coasts, and we'll raid the ships, and we'll invade your country. The third attempt to make reparation. This again was as sincere as the others. Emotionally it was sincere, in its consequences it was quite different. There was a conference. There were two actually. There was one in Brussels, after one in Germany. And at these conferences, the Anti-Slavery Society of Britain prepared the ground by saying, we must do something about slavery in Africa. We've abolished the Atlantic slave trade. We must do something about these slaves in Africa. It's terrible that all this thing is happening. And so what they did is said, it'd be really good if the European powers could take responsibility for freeing Africa from slavery. And so they held a big conference in Brussels. There was a massive map at the front of the conference. It was much bigger than this room, about 20-foot high map. You can see pictures of it. There are engravings of the time. A big map of Africa. And lots of European powers, diplomats, around the map deciding which bit they were going to have. And they divided amongst themselves to free Africa from slavery. The map was prepared for them by the Anti-Slavery Society. They didn't say, oh, we're going to take over Africa. We think it'd be really great if we were boss and dominate the whole continent, though that's what happened. Nobody said, let's make a fortune out of exploiting Africa. Nobody said, let's take over Africa, we'll make a heap of money. Though all of them, that's what they did in the end. Why did they say to each other that they were doing it? What did they say to us about what they were doing? They were doing it to make up for the terrible crimes that had been committed against them through the act of slavery. So what I want to say is that every instance of reparation that's ever taken place has always ended up in misery for the people who ought to have been the targets of its largesse. I think the reason is simple, and it's the reason that C.L.R James himself set out. He said that, the truth was that by looking back at the past, what you do through an act of reparation really is to maintain the relationships. You amend them slightly, you make apology for what happened in the past, but you maintain. And the act of reparation must always do that, because it always assumes there is a compensatory power above the people who are being compensated, that it always casts you as the supplicant asking for compensation, and the forgiveness is an act which constitutes you as the welfare recipient of this largesse. And that power relationship will only ever end in the same way, which is once again the colonial powers will get the advantage, because the authorities making reparation for the crimes that they committed will only ever enhance their authority in that relationship. C.L.R James took a slightly different view, and he said at the end of his book, The Black Jacobins, he talked about the West Indians and their independence in the appendix that was added. And he said, when West Indians make themselves independent people in the world, they make themselves into real players for the first time. And he said, and we do it, and he said, without hatred or malice against the foreigner, even the bitter imperialist past. He said, we do it with an eye to the future. And I think that's a different attitude to the act of reparation, because what he's really saying is we have to fight this fight in the present day for equality, for freedom, and not be bound to the past. What are your questions or thoughts? And I'll take a few and then I'll maybe try and answer, but I'm really interested in what you have to say.
I was educated in the Caribbean, and obviously we've done history, and we've done it from a Caribbean perspective. So nothing you've said here was outside the syllabus of Caribbean history. The essays we used to write was like, give the reasons why slavery was abolished. The top one was always economics, as per the Eric Williams prescription. The second was the Wilberforce's et al. Third was the Christmas Rebellion of 1830. But I think one of the most overriding issues that we have had to expand on was the Parliamentary Reforms of 1832, where the West Indian planters could no longer afford to buy the rotten boroughs. And this stemmed, ironically, I believe, from the economics of the West Indies exporting the excess capital, industrialization, and the rise of the middle classes. Yeah, the third thing that I always thought that was always missed was the rise of black nationalism. And I think C.L.R James missed this. The Haitian Revolution was inspired by Boukman, this enigmatic figure. The oath at Boyce Cayman was a raw level of nationalism. Back to the economic part of it was, one of the reasons why we were taught was that cheaper sugar from Cuba and Brazil contributed to the failure of the West Indians planters to produce a product. At the same time, the Napoleonic Wars, which you mentioned, I believe at that point it was being explored in Germany, the establishment of beet sugar. Are these all in line with your thoughts?
Oh yeah, very much. Okay. And thank you, yeah.
You know, really interesting, a lot of stuff I didn't know. When I was reading the C.L.R James, and one of the things that's shocking you can see in the 30s and of his time is him saying, well, the whole thing about Britain, putting itself out in Wilberforce, the history, that they were this moral people who could think of themselves wider than just their national interest and have a sense of morality and, I guess, kindness and duty. And C.L.R James takes that up very well. But to a certain extent today, it seems like what you're saying is knocking against an empty, open door, if you like. As you say, the Bristol Slave Museum or the Cardiff Slave Museum, there's that idea that people could have wider aspirations than their own self-interest does seem to be everything we accept now, and we're, with the bankers taking their profits from the West Indies. Is there a potential cynicism? Wasn't there any goodness in the abolitionists? And isn't there anything positive we can take from that at all?
I agree with everything you said, but you started off by saying that C.L.R James made the point that we weren't freed, slaves actually freed themselves. But then you went on to make the business case for, British capitalism and British colonialism in terms of the end of slavery. So I wondered if you could just make the link between that and what was actually going on amongst the people that C.L.R James was referencing.
Three fantastic contributions. They go to the point. On the first point, absolutely yes, I would love to give more of that level of detail, and it seems to me like you could be giving this talk very easily. People argue back and forward on the money so much. People forget that when Williams went back and looked at the material, they often say, oh, he got his stuff from a guy called Lowell Regatz. There was a historian called Lowell Regatz. And he said, Lowell Regatz is responsible for they called it a myth. I don't think it's a myth at all. The myth of planter decline. Regatz got his stuff from the Anti-Slavery Society because it was all mobilized as argument at the time. People knew about the indebtedness of the plantations. They knew about the bankruptcies because the anti-slavery people had drawn attention to it. The reasons subsequently that there's been this great confusion about the whole affair was really because the story that you know so well in the West Indies was one that was intolerable in Britain and more, actually, in the United States. Because the Eric Williams they argued with wasn't just a student, as he was in 1944. By this time, he was the Prime Minister of Trinidad. Before that, he was a leader of a popular movement. When people were angry with Eric Williams for saying it wasn't just morality that led to the freeing of the slaves. It was economics. That was offensive because it was a component, it was a part of an argument he was making for the independence of the West Indies. He was making a point to say, we don't owe our freedom to you. He was saying, you were only in it for the money. I mean, I'm vulgarizing, but and it wasn't the philanthropic act that we thought it was. And this goes to the second point. It's not just that the plantations were, the estates were indebted. It's not just that they were underinvested. It's not just that the planters as a class were absentees who cared nothing for the industry that they grew rich upon, but also, and they're related, they're intimately related, that the oppressive economic system provoked response. I think this is James's initial contribution, and I'm happy to say that the people have enlarged upon it and understood a great deal more about the subjective reaction of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. And they've understood more because slowly people have looked and started to understand the stories of all the people, and this is true of all the islands, that there were people who withdrew, absented themselves from their plantations and lived in the hills, a separate existence, that there were people who fought, and that that fighting is probably more profound than the peasant wars of the Middle Ages. The resistance of Afro-Caribbeans to the plantation system is profound, and it's part of why it was uneconomic. There's a good reason why planters didn't like to stay in the Caribbean. It's because they were hated and despised. And I don't see the two things as unrelated. I'd say that the impoverishment and the failure, the eventual failure, you know, we must understand that it was in economic terms, it was a massive success throughout most of the 18th century. But by the turn of the 18th, 19th century, it was already the case that it become a complete economic failure. And that's both to do with economics and to do with resistance. And resistance is, without doubt, is a driving force, resistance within the Caribbean. And then this is the last part, and a couple of people have said this, and I'm very glad to say this because I do think it's important. Williams did acknowledge it, and he was caricatured by Seymour Drescher and Roger Anstey as saying that he gave no basis to the argument that there was an anti-slavery movement in Britain that was popular and moral. And that's not true. Williams says that it was there. He says that they should be credited for what they did. You know, some of them were weird people. William Wilberforce, he was very illiberal on many questions. He was, like many of them were, they didn't like the artisans of England rising up against them. Wilberforce was a big supporter of the Peterloo Massacre. He thought that was right on. But they weren't cynics. I don't think Buxton or Wilberforce or Sturge or any of these people sat there thinking, what's the best for British capitalism? I think if we abolish slavery, we'll make a fortune. Now, I should be cautious there because they were very interested in making a fortune. Many of them made fortunes. Joseph Sturge, who led the Anti-Slavery Society, had plantations of free West Indians on which he grew limes. You know, so when you drink your lime juice cordial, that's courtesy of Joseph Sturge. And he did it for a purpose. He bought the plantation to prove that free labour would work. He still owned a plantation in Montserrat, which I'm guessing the relationships were not as liberal as one would hope, that it was still an exploitative relationship. But they were moral people, and the anti-slavery movement was driven by a religious moral sentiment, which is odd to us. It's quite hard for us to see it because not everybody shares the intensity of religious feeling that they did at the time. That's one feature. It's odd for us to see that they weren't that bothered about racial discrimination. That wasn't a thing for them. Some of them were quite racist in their own attitudes, like John Scoble, and yet they were morally appalled by slavery. And that was them. The English Parliament had its own considerations. They were a part of it. You know, they were interested in making money. And the two colluded in this idea. But there's no gainsaying, there's no retreating from the fact. It was the first humanitarian movement. It wasn't the freedom that people deserved, but it was the end of slavery.
First of all, I'm from Bristol, and I just wanted to give a little plug for the Commonwealth Museum, because it was actually a really great educational experience. And it was free, but it's sadly closed now. But I guess what I wanted to ask was, the slave trade itself in the British Empire was abolished in 1808, but it took, another almost 25 years for actually slavery as an institution to be abolished. And I was wondering if there's anything, from what you've been talking about, the sort of link between economic and moral imperatives and sort of motivations, is there anything that can explain that gap?
How does a nation handle guilt over, 10 generations? It's a difficult one. How do you engage people with the past? How do you engage people with such an emotional subject as slavery? How do you get people to feel and remember and put that into some kind of historical context which doesn't demean it like another tourist, circuit?
In terms of reparations, James has an interesting quote. I could see why those who are against reparations would like to take his quotes or this argument in terms of black self-determination and sort of use it to their own ends. But there is something that he said when he talked about the legend about the abolition of slavery resulting in the destruction of whites being a shameless lie. He went on to say, it's typical of the means by which reaction covers its crimes in the past and seeks to block advance in the present. That I see as a code that can be relied upon to substantiate those like yourself who would choose to oppose reparations. What do you think about that?
On the history thing first, I often have it with students. I want to talk about teaching because I do teach students. I'm currently teaching a class of students from the University of California. One of the things that they often say to me is, I don't get it. What was the thing? What is this gap? Like you say, it's massive between the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. And the abolition of slavery is a complicated thing because 1833 is officially the abolition of slavery, but then they abolished it again, if I can say it that way, because they created this thing that was called apprenticeship, which turned out to be slavery in another name. But it's still a massive gap. There are two ways you can go at it. You can describe the emotional or moral reason why the slave trade was identified as the problem. And I think you have to bear in mind, you've got to think into the position when in Britain, most people were in favour of slavery. They didn't think it was a wicked thing necessarily. It came to be that, as we know from the petitioning, that probably most people disapproved of slavery, or at least the slave trade. In that process, in the campaign, the one killer blow that was struck by the anti-slave campaigners was to illuminate what the Middle Passage meant. And they did it with a very simple thing, which was a drawing, which is derived from an actual plan. And you've seen it, it's been reproduced 1,000 times, of how you place the slaves, how you house the slaves on the ship. And it's a drawing there, tiny figures, all in black, inked in black. And when you look as a person, just an ordinary person looking, you think, oh my God, that is hell. And that was a compelling point of and it was true, that the Middle Passage was hell. It was a brutality beyond imagination, that people would be thrown overboard at the point when they were no longer a viable economic investment, when they became ill, or if it became difficult, or just if the market was going the wrong way. They would kill people rather than waste food on them, rather than waste passage upon them. It was a brutal, shocking thing, and that people were more offended by the slave trade, perhaps, than slavery itself, may be confusing to us in retrospect, but it made perfect sense at the time in the England of the time, because it was true. The Middle Passage was particularly gruesome, and it condensed everything that was wrong. So when the pressure was on, there were two sides in this debate. Some people had interests in keeping slavery. Other people had a strong feeling that it should be abolished. Some people had an economic interest in abolishing it. But as the two sides debated the issue, the worst instance was the one that was changed. However, that's not the whole story, because there's also a pragmatic, and Eric Williams is very good on this, there's a pragmatic political story going on underneath. James Stephens, who was a lawyer in the Admiralty, who was himself a part of the Clapham sect, who were motivated by abolitionism, he wanted to get abolition, at least of the trade, through. And he realised there was a pragmatic loophole he could use. He could say, and as he did, he said to the Admiralty, look, he says, if we make an issue out of the slave trade, we can use it as a weapon in the war against France. He wanted to abolish the slave trade, but he thought, if I make it into a kind of pragmatic, cynical thing about playing a trick on France, the more cynical people around me will agree with me. And that's what he did. He said, look, we can scupper the French ships through the abolition of the slave trade. And they said, oh, what a brilliant idea. We've been looking for an excuse to search those ships for years. We need a moral justification for searching the ships. Thank you, Mr. Stephens, you've given us one. We must make sure to do a bit of anti-slavery blabber in our military promotion. It was cynical, but the consequence was that slave trade abolished, not slavery. The people that were motivated by the desire to abolish the slave trade were serious. They thought, well, look, this is a chink. You know, we've broken through. They weren't cynical. There's also the political consequence of Britain at the time. The impact of the French Revolution was that it quieted the militant populist spirit in Britain, because anybody who was for big reforms was in a position where they could be targeted and said, oh, you're as bad as the French. You're a Jacobin. You should go to prison. So the whole of the anti-slavery movement was basically quieted by the French Revolution and the reaction as a response in England. And that was something that kind of put the reform movement back for a long time. And we shouldn't forget that in 1838, there was something like a revolution in Britain and in the West Indies at the same time. What I mean to say is that there was a conspiracy on the part of Joseph Sturge. They snuck in one night to Parliament and they put a late motion, you know, about 11 o'clock, when there was about 6 people in the chamber, and they said, abolish the slave trade, you know. And, 4 of the MPs put their hands up and 2 said no. And then they said, brilliant, we've passed the law abolishing the slave trade. Now, everybody knew, according to parliamentary procedure, this was a complete and utter scam. But they timed their scam brilliantly, because the packet ships going from London to the Caribbean were leaving the following day. And which meant to say they could put in the report would say, Britain abolishes slave trade, Westminster abolishes slave trade. It took about 25 days in those days to go across. So the news arrived, all the different Caribbean islands, slave trade abolished. Wow, this was news, People were thrilled. I mean, they always knew it was coming. Big meetings were happening all over the place. Meanwhile, in Westminster, they said, what happened? How did we abolish the slave trade? Well, it was 11 o'clock. There was nobody in the Houses of Parliament. They were very angry. They said, you can't do that. That's cheating. That's anti-democratic. That wasn't a real vote. And they said, well, it doesn't matter, because the people in the Caribbean think it's a real vote, and you cannot tell them to go back to being apprentices, not slaves, to being apprentices after you've made them free. And the Colonial Office knew that was the case, and they sent instructions. They said, look, it's a fait accompli, we can't stop it. People have freed themselves. They did. William Knibb held, Baptist leader, Jamaica, he held big prayer meetings on the news, and there were thousands. The hills were covered in people praying and singing and all glorying in the fact that they were free. And you couldn't, once they'd done that, you couldn't say, oh, and we tricked you, go back. It was a social revolution in the West Indies. There's a bigger question in front of us, and the bigger question is the guilt, and how do you cope with guilt? I'm going to say something now that maybe is going to irritate people. I don't feel guilty at all. I am a white man. I live in Britain. The British Empire was built upon exploitation of colonial peoples and also of industrial workers. And I'm not responsible for any of that. And I feel no guilt whatsoever. And the reason I say that is because guilt never helped anyone. Guilt is an emotion, Sigmund Freud tells us, which is basically built on narcissism. The whole idea of I am guilty isn't really about being nice to other people. It's about me, me, me. I am so guilty. You know, people do this now, and I kind of cringe inside when I see it. But people whose ancestors owned slaves, and you can see it, there's pictures all over the internet of they put slave collars on, and they go with their families to West Africa and apologize, and they say how, they kind of make themselves into slaves, and they apologize to the people. And I think that is degrading. I think it's actually degrading. It's morally degrading. It's reprehensible, because it's not about fixing anything. It's all about them. It's all about their own emotional feeling of guilt, which at the core is about narcissism and self-importance. Guilty people are not trustworthy people. They are preoccupied with themselves. All that apologizing. You see it in Australia. It was Sorry Day. Did you notice it was Sorry Day the other day? White Australians say they're really sorry. And the natural response, of course, everybody is not sorry enough, which is a good comic reaction. But the truth is, Sorry Day is a kind of massive self-indulgence which never fixed anything. It really never fixed anything. What I do think, as a teacher, this was what my University of California students said to me eventually. They said, you give such a miserable view of Britain. They said, I'm really quite enjoying it here. And, and I felt a small reprimand, because I do think what you can do and what you must do is tell the truth. I think the truth is the thing. And in all respects, I think it's important to tell the history. All the suffering and the pain and the problems and the challenges and the fantastic movements of resistance, you've got to tell all those stories to tell the truth about what happened. So when I hear the quote from C.L.R. James, I think he doesn't say reparations. He says, which is right, of the people he's talking about, that they lied. Yeah, they lied. It's true. They lied big time. British people too, representatives of the empire, and ordinary Britons tell themselves all kinds of little fibs or big lies about how great Britain is. And that's not entirely bad. Britain has done some magic things. It's a fabulous place. I wouldn't dismiss Britain as a place. It's a great place. The people are fantastic. But there's some terrible, terrible chapters in British history. I think it's right to illuminate those chapters. It's right that any lies must be exposed. I think, we've got to be honest about what happened. The important thing is to address the problems in the present too. We can't live in the past. It's not about fixing the problems of the past. The problems that need fixing are the problems here. It's the inequalities that happen today that will be addressed. And we can help that by understanding the problems of the past. But we can't do it by living in the past. And I think that's the problem with reparation. And I think James would have said the same thing. The reparation will always be to maintain the authority of those who have power. The reparation is always of the quality of an apology, which ensures that the person who apologizing is morally superior to the person who is apologized to.